All right, welcome everyone, and we're going to try and go fairly quickly because we only have until 11:30. And obviously, this meeting is on to receive a briefing on the revised water withdrawal regulations. Do we have someone to move the adoption of the agenda? Lynn, thank you. And I guess with that, we're just going to jump right into the presentation. It's not a PowerPoint behind me because of we're currently sitting in the legislative session, but we do have the handout in front of us. And I think if you're watching online, you'll actually be able to see the slideshow. So for anyone watching online. So with that, I'll turn it over to our guests. If you could just introduce yourself for Hansard before you speak, that would be excellent. So the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Brad Colwill, Deputy Minister of Environment, Energy and Climate Action. With me is George Summers and Bruce Raymond, who will have a turn to speak here in a bit, and I'll let them introduce as well. I appreciate the invitation to be here to speak to it. You're right that the slide deck is a little lengthy, but I think we can go through it fairly expeditiously. And on that, we'll dive right in. We were invited to give a briefing on the water withdrawal regulations. As a bit of to set the table for that, I guess we're speaking just briefly on some of the background of the Water Act because it's important as the foundational piece. 2017 received royal assent, so ourselves and I think everyone in this committee we're happy that we're getting to the finish line to have this in place, and everyone recognizes the importance of that, and the Act itself recognizes quite a few significant pieces: common good, the balance of human and ecological well-being, evidence-based decision-making being a critical piece for it, and of course transparency and accountability. The Act was designed taking elements from the Environmental Protection Act with some additions such as the purpose piece I mentioned there. The water management planning areas, which is what would be the next step, and one that we as a department are very excited about, and will be a significant step and require a lot of work to get that done as well. George, I wonder if would you be okay giving 3 or 4 sentences about what to expect with those? It's the only time we talk to the mayor.
Yeah, sure. The intent there is to allow the development of regulatory controls over different sort of aspects of water use or impacts of water, focusing on 4 different areas. One of them would be a more general category, which might be used to look at, say, nutrients in surface water and groundwater. Another one looking at well field protection. There's also one looking at protection of sensitive aquatic ecosystems, and then finally one looking at municipal water supply areas. Before any of those actually get going, and I guess I should back up a little bit, those are meant to be individual plans for specific areas, whether it's a watershed or a group of watersheds or a portion of a watershed, so it's not a single regulation across the province. What there will be first, though, is a general regulation, I think it's under Section 25 of the Act, which would prescribe the approach to how these plan areas are developed. So it'll be something where I'm sure we'll have lots of good discussion, but a lot of the focus will be on stakeholder representation, trying to gain consensus, things like that. The other thing is these plans are supposed to be living documents so that they would be, as monitoring shows progress or decline or whatever, things can be adjusted and all that. So it's meant to be sort of a management tool. The real hope is that rather than just have a whole set of rules now, we want to have a process where we can plan our future when it comes to water management. So that's in a nutshell sort of what the intent is. So the first step will be the general regulation, which will describe how these plans are formulated, what stakeholders are involved, how they operate, that sort of stuff.
Thanks, George. And it's one we're certainly looking forward to and see as a very important tool in the Water Act's evolution. The Water Act itself proclaimed February 2021 with an effective date of June 16th, 2021. In the third slide, I'll walk through a little briefly on that, but just on the second slide on implementing the Water Act, this is a repeat of one we've had before to this very standing committee. The key piece being the Act may have been the what, the regulations we consider as the how, right? The details that are to give us guidance on how to govern with this piece of legislation. The four regulations, well construction, water supply, wastewater treatment, sewage disposal regulations, water withdrawal regulations were provided to the committee with our last copy, or our latest copy, with the plan to have those enacted before the June 16th deadline. On the next slide, just to make sure, the process for this one was a little different, and the reason why it was different is because of the guidance that's actually in the Water Act itself. The Water Act has a clause that requires any regulation prior to enactment to be provided to the Standing Committee 90 days prior to its enactment. So balancing that and our desire, and I believe everyone's desire to have the Water Act in place, that's why we went the path we did. And you can see the two arrows where we proclaimed the Water Act to be effective June 16th. We gave the regulations to the committee the same day to meet that 90-day requirement. And our plan is to enact those regulations prior to the June 16th effective date. We appreciate that the committee and everyone else may have some additional comments on that. We're certainly open to making amendments if they are ones that need to be made in due course, but our plan is to make sure that we get the Water Act in place, and to do that we need to have regulations that support that as well. A couple more slides for me, and then I'll turn it over to the people who know worlds more about this topic than I do. The next slide kind of just speaks of the process that we followed. I feel I just mentioned that, so I'll skip right to the next slide again. And just there's a few points that we felt was important to clarify as part of this conversation. And again, thanks for inviting us to provide a briefing on the water withdrawal regulations. There's a few comments and beliefs out there that we want to make sure either get corrected or clarified. The first one is the notion of grandfathering. And as stated here, the wells supplying the holding ponds will be subject to the same rules as other approved wells. We use the term grandfathering. I think it was interpreted by some as that grandfathering being an exemption in perpetuity, where there wouldn't be any permits involved, and that's not the case. The wells that would be feeding these ponds would be subject to permitting, and there's no guaranteed permits provided for them, and in fact there's no guaranteed permits provided there's no guarantees for any of our permits that are provided. Another key piece, just to make sure we get clarified, the multiple low capacity wells supplying a single system are treated the same way as high capacity wells. The transition provisions has generated a lot of conversation. I suspect we'll have a discussion on this today. A key piece with that is Section 77 of the Water Act is what actually prescribes the time it takes to get in line with the Water Act if you're coming from an environment that existed beforehand. And it's one that couldn't be changed in those recent regulations because it's founded in the Water Act itself. The proposed regulations create a new purpose of high-capacity well explicitly for agricultural irrigation, and the research conducted on such irrigation and soil health would be completed by an independent academic institution, and that's a piece there seems to be some differing views on that part too, and we can't stress that enough. The last part I want to mention before passing on to George. I know the committee made recommendations to our department on what they wanted to see in the Water Act, and just to revisit those briefly, and George will go in a little deeper on that. I know there was 5 recommendations. The first one being to proclaim the Act, which is why those previous slides we went down that path to get it proclaimed immediately. One was on differentiating between saltwater and freshwater wells. Through our communications, I think that got lost. We did amend the regulations to reflect those differences. 2 of the other recommendations were ones that the regulations we presented weren't the home for presenting them. The 5-year versus 2-year transition was one of the items there where that's actually founded in the Act, not the regulations. The notion of providing updates on any research to the committee is one that we have no problem, as George mentioned, keeping the committee apprised of anything that's happening in that area. But it's not something that's listed in the regulation because we didn't think that was the home for such a direction for us. And lastly, one was on the moratorium expansion, which we'll touch on here in a bit as well. So I'm going to throw it over to George Summers, who's going to walk us through some of the history of our previous draft.
Yeah, and I'll be pretty brief because we've been through this for a number of years, quite frankly. But yeah, just some of the highlights of the original draft, and then Bruce will be talking about some of the adjustments we've made to it. But one of the first key things is that we're combining the management of groundwater extraction and surface water extraction into as similar set of rules and processes as we can. They are linked closely scientifically, and so it just doesn't make sense to deal with them on a separate basis. So similar approval criteria and similar administrative process for both these ends of the same resource, if you will. We've also very significantly lowered the level at which one needs a permit. So we've expanded the scope of regulation on wells very dramatically, going from what essentially was 50 gallons a minute down to 4 gallons a minute, or in current parlance, 25 cubic meters a day, which is still a reasonable amount of water, but we've very significantly expanded our regulatory control, if you will. The other thing we're looking at, which makes more sense from an environmental point of view, is looking at the daily flow rather than the instantaneous peak flow. From an environmental point of view, it's really more the daily flow that's important. So as a consequence, we've created a new category of well, if you will. So there are domestic wells which are not unregulated, but the regulation really applies to how they're constructed and who constructs them. And then the low-capacity wells, which will require permits to operate and all that sort of stuff. And then finally, high-capacity wells, which exist as a category now. The other thing we did was, in the past, we had a pretty rigorous sort of approach to assessing applications and approving or issuing approvals, but it wasn't very transparent. So we've put those considerations explicitly in the regulation, so it is much more transparent. So things like the cumulative effect of withdrawals, effect on stream flow and aquatic habitat. So these are things that the minister must consider, not just something in the background that we sort of look at. Also, we've clearly indicated that there are priorities for water use when there's not enough water to go around and meet all the desires people have, and we've talked about that. I think even the Act looks at that as well. Another thing that we did, there was lots of discussion about how people were using clusters of low-capacity wells to get around the moratorium, for instance. And so we've clearly indicated that it doesn't really matter whether you get the water out of a bunch of little wells or one big well, they're going to be treated in the same fashion. And the other thing we did was we put the moratorium, I guess, on stronger footing or more clear footing, I guess, for the to explicitly state it in regulation rather than have it in a directive. So that was kind of where we were. We had more consultation on that. Actually, had really lots of really detailed, useful discussions with folks, including with you folks as well. And so just looking at the recommendations from the committee itself, so immediately proclaiming the Act, as Brad mentioned, we've done that, and so it'll be effective June 16th. And we're really pleased with finally getting it on the ground, because in addition to the water withdrawal regulations, there are a whole bunch of other things that are, well field protection, new well construction regulations, administration of water and wastewater systems that are also waiting for this. So pleased with that. Another recommendation from the committee was the expansion of the moratorium to all industry. And I can understand certainly the notion that, okay, for sort of, if you allow the word penalizing or restricting what one sector can do, maybe we should do it for all sectors. But at the same time, really the issue is not how you get the water, it's what it's being used for. And so from that point of view, it just doesn't make sense. Whether you, get this water out of a high-capacity well shared with 30,000 other people, or whether your own little well, really doesn't change the demand for water. So high-capacity wells do not create water demand. They're just a different way of actually meeting the demand. And in lots of settings, certainly urban ones, they're the sensible way of doing it. From a protection of water quality point of view, they're infinitely better. But you can picture trying to service Charlottetown with 30 or 40,000 individual private wells. Just doesn't make sense. So I guess where I'm going with this, there's nothing inherently wrong with a high-capacity well. The issue really, when we look at it, is what it's used for. High-capacity wells do not create water demand. They're just a more efficient way of collecting the water. So from that point of view, we don't really support the notion of extending the moratorium. Again, we can appreciate the notion of trying to create a level playing field and equity and all that, but the focus on high capacity versus low capacity wells, I guess in our view, not the right spot to put that emphasis. Referring research proposals to the Standing Committee, we certainly appreciate the interaction with the committee and, I guess particularly the keen interest you've shown in what we're doing. And we'd be very happy to involve and receive input on research proposals. We also, and I can't speak to this as well as Bruce can, but have a research policy which will help guide us. But we're certainly open to interaction with the committee on that, and we'll be happy to keep you folks informed on any developments in that regard. Shortening the compliance period from 5 years to 2 years. Well, Brad already talked about this, but the fact is that the Water Act does place some constraints on what we can do, but having said that, we would certainly be happy to entertain any way we can accelerate the adoption of these new approaches, regulations, or whatever. So we're open to suggestion on how we can do that within the constraints of what we have for the law. It's certainly always our hope to be able to adopt things that we think are good and useful as quickly as possible. So, as I say, there are some constraints, but we're open to talk to folks on if there are ways of accelerating adoption. Certainly, the last thing I want to see would be to have 500 renewal applications come in on June 15th, 2016, or 2026 rather. So, we're keen to get things moving also. And the other thing to keep in mind, this is not about just water withdrawal. This is about everything. It's whether you're looking at constructing a new wastewater treatment system or something like that. And so the choice of 5 years was not arbitrary. It was actually carefully thought out. I went back through my files yesterday. My first correspondence on the Coles Creek well field was from 2007. So 13 years before the taps are turned on. That's a pretty extreme example, admittedly, but for a lot of other things, 5 years is quite reasonable as a time frame to do the studies, to figure out what you got to do, go through the tendering, construct things and all that. You can't just change in a dime. So I think 5 years in a lot of cases is reasonable. It depends very much on the type of project. And so I think that's something we're certainly keen to look at, but we do have some constraints. Differentiation between freshwater and saltwater wells, we certainly agree. Saltwater, freshwater sort of interfaces are interesting and important areas, and saltwater wells have special sort of characteristics, and they can have effects on freshwater wells and all that stuff. So we have expanded the considerations when looking at permits to include wells in coastal areas. And so I guess with that, I'm ready to turn it over to Bruce, who's going to talk about the revisions we've made with the feedback. Again, I want to express our gratitude to you guys for your feedback, not just the report, but the discussion we've had, and also to the many other groups like the Coalition. And we've spent hours and hours with them going through stuff and a lot of useful suggestions, which we've adopted.
All right. Thank you, George. And so, yes, I would like to echo George's appreciation for the input that we've gotten from Islanders, from this committee. We've utilized them very carefully to make some changes in our draft and what we think are some important improvements. So just to review those for you, I won't go through all the instances, but there were many cases where we've tried to strengthen the regulation, the regulatory power by changing the minister may to the minister shall. We've added the concept of the conservation of water in a number of areas in the regulations. We've included the current water withdrawal policy and right in the regulation. That adds strength to that policy, and it certainly makes it very clear what the rules are that everyone has to work within in order to be able to access water while still maintaining an appropriate amount of water for the protection of the environment. Another thing that we added to the regulations is the requirement where the minister may require a drought contingency plan. This is intended to be for applicants who have large water withdrawal programs, and in the event of a large or significant drought, that they would have already developed plans as to how that they would react to that drought. The next thing that was changed to the regulation was that the provision was made for the research into the impact of agricultural irrigation and high-capacity wells. It's an important request that currently there is a proposal that everyone, I think, is aware of here to do really good independent research, and we needed to be able to enable that. The provision to grandfather existing clusters of low-capacity wells used for irrigations. These are generally feeding into holding ponds, but not exclusively. And those were constructed legally, and so this provision grandfathers them in, but it doesn't, as it was made a point earlier, it doesn't grandfather and guarantee them a permit. Rather, it grandfathers their eligibility to apply for a permit. And in all other regards, they have to meet all of the other parts of the regulations and policies in order to obtain one. Then, as we pointed out just briefly, differentiating the factors between saltwater and freshwater wells is put right in the regulations. There were also some clarifications done, such as the permit exemption that is there for remediating contaminated water, and we clarified that that applies to department-approved petroleum remediation plans. That extraction permit application assessments have to consider not just the watershed they're in, but also adjacent watersheds, and that we've also expanded the assessment to consider the entire aquatic ecosystem and not just fish. I don't think we had ever intended that it would not be protective of others. Fish are often utilized as a sentinel species, but changing the terminology makes it very clear that we actually want to protect all parts of the aquatic ecosystem. So there's a requirement for permit holders to supply water usage data, and we've clarified that the minister can set a schedule for that, and that would be normally part of their permit, and that's not just an on-request kind of thing. We believe it was already in the ability of permitting permits, but this makes it very clear that is. Then there was also just two details of small wells that require permits, and we added the fee structure for those permits into the fee table. So then, we just talked for a minute on the agriculture research policy. In addition to enabling agricultural irrigation research, we thought it would be important to let people understand what we mean by when we would approve that, and the approval being required by the regulation. And essentially what we're looking for here is that we're looking for independent research. There's a requirement in the policy that the research be undertaken by scientific researchers, not just anybody. And those researchers need to be from an academic institution, a scientific research institute, or government. Very important that those results be made public, and that those results are required, in our view, to be made public whether or not the science is favorable to what that some people might like to see. The science answer is the answer and needs to be exposed. The last thing is that the wells that are constructed and permitted for this research can only be utilized for the research, and at the end of the research, they have to be decommissioned. And that's so that they don't become a way to get around the moratorium, which is no one's intent. So Then I'd like to move on a bit to holding ponds, just to supply the committee with some information about those to date. One of the things that is a lot of people are concerned about holding ponds. From our environmental perspective, these ponds are holding clean water, and our issue is not the pond holding the water itself, but rather the source of the water. The ponds themselves are not regulated, and they're outside of what is intended by the scope of the water withdrawal regulations. There are, of course, existing holding ponds and existing low-capacity wells supplying them. They were constructed fully within the law, and we have to be careful that attempts to revoke their use could be problematic. That being said, as I pointed out earlier, their use still is regulated. It's not unfettered. They have to have, at the end of the transitional period, permits that are assessed against the regulations and policy like all other permits. So then, in the interim, the department has the ability to examine if there are issues with existing holding ponds. And we have done that in the past with low-capacity wells. If there is issues, we do examine them, and there have been a few instances where we have had to require remediation in one shape or another. We've included a couple of maps for your knowledge. This first one is the holding ponds. So now each holding pond is probably fed by a couple, 2 or 3 wells. So there would be low-capacity wells in conjunction with those. The cluster of low-capacity wells, what those are is where there are multiple low-capacity wells that are joined together with a transmission line, and they supply an agricultural irrigation system directly, no holding pond involved. And then we've also put on the 36 high-capacity wells. These are the ones that have been long-standing since the time the moratorium was originally put in place back in 2002. And there is some development can happen until June the 16th without permits. And so we always put a date at the bottom of things like this so that you understand that the information is current to April the 6th in this case. Then the last piece is on the map of the surface water pumping sites for irrigation. These change or can change from year to year. Most of them have been in place for many years. Some of them have, a few of them have only been in place for a few years, and an application for getting a permit for this can come in at any time, and we assess it, and there's no moratorium for these. And up until now, they are on one-year permits, and we renew them each year, as the case may be. And with the coming of the Water Act, when they eventually get permitted under the Water Act, they'll have 5-year permits like all other withdrawal permits. So that's the end of the information for you. I see, Deputy, you have read?
I want to add one more thing too before, I know we're pressed for time, but I think it's important to convey these 2 fine gentlemen have dedicated probably most of their life to this topic, and I just wanted to thank them on the record for everything they've done. It's really amazing working with them and how enlightening it is, and it's great to see the Water Act get into place and see their hard work come to fruition. So just want to say that.
Thank you. Hopefully you still have lots of life left, though. It's not all over yet. All right, well, I appreciate your quick presentation. I know we're limited on time, so we're going to jump right into questions. And Lynn, you are up first.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I want to take a minute, first of all, to thank all three of you for making the time to come in. I know our request to you to come was certainly short notice, and I appreciate you working with us to get that in. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I will jump right into a few questions that I have for you. And I think where I'll start is on some of the points that you had made in your presentation in particular. So I'd like to start by talking about the notion of grandfathering in holding ponds. And frankly, I think no one believes that they don't ever need to be compliant. I think the definition of compliant is almost what seems to have changed from my understanding of it. So as I understand it, in the original drafts of the regulations, a holding pond had 5 years, and after that point, it needed to draw less water than a high-capacity well. It was not allowed to draw more than 345 cubic meters a day. And as I understand it, that's no longer a requirement. It is still able, in theory, to draw as much water as a high-capacity well, even after the 5-year part. Would that be an accurate description?
Yeah. Firstly, we gotta not talk about holding ponds, because the holding ponds themselves don't get permits. It's the low-capacity wells that are feeding those. And the original draft of the regulations did not have grandfathering for multiple low-capacity wells feeding agricultural irrigation. And therefore, they could not apply for a permit for multiple low-capacity wells. With the grandfathering on eligibility, now they'll be able to apply for the multiple low-capacity wells. And that would indeed be over the 345 cubic meters a day criteria.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So then, as I've understood it, is correct. Previously, there was no mechanism for multiple low-capacity wells that are feeding feeding a holding pond to continue to withdraw as much water as a high-capacity well, and that's changed in this draft. So I don't believe that I've misunderstood this. I think I've got that correct. I know the Minister and I have gone back and forth on whether or not this is an accurate understanding, but that is what I'm hearing from you. Is that correct?
They can apply. And it presumes that there is sufficient and available water in the watershed to get their permit.
Lynn?
Chair. Right. So assuming the water is there, in theory, they would be able to continue to withdraw as much water as a high-capacity well. That would be an option that didn't exist previously but is new to these regulations.
With revisions, yes.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So I definitely did have that correct. So that's an important distinction. And I think this is the point that a lot of islanders are concerned about. Because even when you look at these water withdrawal maps, most of the province, this is not going to be an issue in. We can see it's really a few specific areas that we're seeing these high amounts of withdrawals happening. And we tend to talk about our water as if it's all in one pot underneath Prince Edward Island and we're all just drawing from the same one pot. But that's not the case. You know, we've spoken to a couple of hydrogeologists on this one, and water very much is in little pots underwater, the aquifers underground. So you could certainly have too many straws, if you will, sipping from the same pots and have an impact in one area, but not have a negative impact on the whole of the province. And I don't think anyone believes we're going to run out of water as a province. But there's certainly some concerns, particularly from people who are in and around the Dunk River, that all of these holding ponds that are going in will have an impact. We do understand that the river is fed from the aquifer, and if we have what now amounts to, I believe, 16 new holding ponds, all pulling from that same aquifer, people are concerned that what's going to happen is we're going to see that Dunk River drop below the stream maintenance flow of 70%, like it did last summer when there was far less demand on the river. So I can understand people's concerns, and I know we've gotten into semantics back and forth with the Minister on whether or not grandfathered in just means they don't have to backfill them. But no, it's absolutely the case. They will be able to draw as much water as a high-capacity well, assuming that the permit is given. But that possibility exists, and it didn't before. So I suppose I'd like to know why this wasn't in previous drafts of the regulations.
You want to take that one? Yeah.
It's hard with the, we're not facing each other. So a couple pieces on that one. The initial draft that was provided, I know, was kicking around sometime before I was there. But my understanding, it was drafted to generate the conversation, and the possibility of those ponds and their treatment, I guess perhaps wasn't fully thought out the same way, and that's the value of the consultation that came to light for us, that with their construction happening and done legally, as Bruce mentioned in his presentation, it would be there. But I think the important part to recognize with this is, we do recognize that the permitting happens. Anytime there's a permit granted, or even the decision on the permit, yay or nay, the water availability in that watershed, and you're right, each watershed is its own little pot, right, that we look at, and we reserve a certain amount of that pot right off the bat for environmental flows. And that remaining portion of the pot is what is eligible to be permitted. And as we get all of these low capacity wells in combination with surface water extraction permits, and basically every water extraction permit into compliance, the cumulative impact of all of that permitted allotment can't exceed that amount that we would deem safe to do so. So while the eligibility is grandfathered in, and you're correct, it is. There would be, if you have a situation where the number of users on a watershed perhaps exceed what that safe level would be, if there is a demand for each of them, then everyone wouldn't be able to get that full demand for it, if that makes sense. There would be a ratcheting down or denial of permits to get within that safe level.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. And you speak to the fact that there's supposed to be a reserve. There's a certain amount, and that's what we're allowed to permit within. And that's great in theory, but we know that's absolutely not what happened last summer with the Dunk River. We were already below stream base flow, and that permit was still issued. So I suppose when I look at the subsection 5.5, it seems to state that the withdrawal would constitute an unacceptable adverse impact, what happened with the Dunk River. Would you agree that what happened with the Dunk River would constitute an unacceptable adverse effect?
Sorry, what was that section again?
5.5 of the subsection 5.5.
So section 5.5 that defines the 70% median monthly flow. Yes, that was where the river was in during last year.
Lynn?
Would you agree that that was an adverse effect?
Adverse. You go ahead.
Yeah, so what these regulations do is they define it as an adverse, unacceptable adverse effect.
Lynn?
Would you agree that what happened with the dunk was an unacceptable adverse effect, but the permit went ahead anyway?
Well, because the regulations defined it as such, yes.
Lynn?
Under these new draft of the regulations, would the minister still have the ability to approve a permit that would allow an unacceptable adverse effect as defined by the regulations?
The minister has to be satisfied that it won't have an unacceptable adverse effect.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair, but the minister wasn't satisfied by that last summer. The minister knew it would have an unacceptable adverse effect and still issued the permit. I'm curious if these regulations allow the minister to knowingly make a decision that will have negative consequences on a waterway. It looks to me like the minister still has that power, and I'm trying to understand why they would.
Well, firstly, the permits are issued in the spring. They're not issued at the time that the adverse effect that we're talking about would occur. And so what the minister has to believe is that there wouldn't be an adverse effect. Then that's what the The criteria are about what defines that unacceptable adverse effect. If the criteria are met, then we would be issuing the permit. And I might point out also that you might take a look at Section 6, which has the direction for people to whom a permit has been issued. So when a permit has been issued to someone, they are required by Section 6, that Section 6, subsection 3, that they are to cease pumping when it falls below that maintenance flow criteria.
Lynn?
That is what happened last summer, though. The minister gave a special permit after the water levels fell below. We know this already. So I'm curious, as I read this, I don't see anything that prevents the minister from being able to issue a permit, even if the minister is aware that it will have an unacceptable adverse effect. And I think that is a mistake. I don't think the minister should have that power.
No, I don't think that's the case. What the structure of 5 indicates is that there is unacceptable adverse effects that the minister is considering. That's in subsection 4. Subsection 5 is a definition of a couple of things that actually are defined as unacceptable adverse effects. So those are not things that the minister considers, they are defined that way. So that the minister cannot issue a permit if there were to be unacceptable adverse effects, and those are defined as such.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So as I understand this, what happened with the dunk last summer could not happen this summer after June 16th with the Water Act in effect.
That would be the case for the minister issuing new permits under the Water Act, under these water withdrawal regulations.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that distinction. I would like it to be clear that the minister is not able to issue permits that will have a negative adverse effect. And you're telling me that that's clearly spelled out in the Water Act.
It's spelled out in the regulations.
Lynn?
I appreciate that distinction very much. A point was made earlier that I wanted to come back to a bit on the research project that is going to be coming forward, and you had said the science answer is the answer. And I appreciate that, but I suppose what I'm wondering is what the question is that we are answering. And I think the question you ask has such a profound difference on what the answer is actually going to be. If the question is, are we going to run out of water as a province, I think we already know the answer is no. Will one high-capacity well have a negative adverse effect on a watershed? No, I don't think that's a likely outcome at all. So what we were wondering with the research project that's supposed to happen is, what is the question we are trying to answer? I think no one in this committee wants to see this issue kicked down the road longer. And if a research project is going to take 6 years to complete, I can completely understand that that's necessary. And also at the end of that 6 years, I would like whoever is on this committee to feel they've now got the information they need to move forward with it. So I suppose what I'm wondering is specifically about very local watershed areas, and any given area on the Dunk or the Wilmot, or an area that we already are seeing high levels of extraction. What is the amount of water that we have to play with? What do we actually have that we can take safely? How many large users are there in the area who would like access to it? What is the fair share amount for each of those farmers that we can use in a sustainable way? I think that's what I want to know. And when we were trying to have this conversation with Van den Heuvel on the research project, the terms of reference on what is it that we're trying to find out was never clear. So I wonder if you can tell me what the terms of reference on the research project are yet.
I'll start, and I think Bruce may be able to speak to some of the specifics on the first part of your question, or the middle part. So on the terms of reference, the proposal was provided to the committee, and that came across loud and clear. The committee requested a terms of reference, and our consideration of what path we're going to go down with this one, and we committed to endeavoring towards this research. The first step is the development of an oversight committee, which would include ourselves, watershed representation. And the first task of that committee would be to develop, finalize terms of reference, which would answer those very questions. And the intent is that we would then provide it to the committee as requested. There's some other pieces, Bruce, I don't know if you wanted to add on some of the research that's being done already for levels.
So yes, the existing research that's underway has been for 5 years, is to answer the question of what are the levels of water versus the impact on fish as a sentinel species in streams. And that is, like I say, is underway. There are interim reports that are available on the government website. There will be more reports as the research proceeds. And thus far, there has not been any demonstrated impact on the fish populations. And the plan is to change the extraction so as to be able to provide an impact that the researchers can measure. And so there's an extension now happening on that project for 3 years.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. That feels like a different question, though. What is the stream base flow that's necessary for the aquatic life in the stream to still be healthy? It feels like a really different question than how much water can we take out of the aquifer and still keep a healthy and functioning ecosystem. Those feel like really different questions. I'm not sure how adding one new high-capacity well to a river or an area is going to tell you what the safe amount of recharge that you can use is. I mean, I think we all agree farmers need access to water. We need to know what the safe amount of water is that we can take from a local area and then figure out how many individuals in the area need access to that water and then what is a reasonable amount for each individual. I'm not hearing anything like that from the research project that's being proposed.
The reason for that is that a large amount of what you just described is well known within the purview of the expertise of hydrogeology. And that is the work that they do on a day-to-day basis of determining how much water is there and how much and how it can be utilized and extracted. What the missing piece is for those hydrogeologists is to really define in detail the exact amount that needs to be left in the stream, and particularly in PEI streams. What we mean by that is that research done elsewhere has good guidance, and we utilize that, but PEI has a very generous bedrock with a very generous recharge and a generous stream flow as a result. And what we need to know is whether or not those criteria that are developed elsewhere really are exactly perfect for PEI. And that's what the research, the additional piece that the research does. The research is not intended to be the entire answer and to repeat the entirety of the knowledge of hydrogeology. It's to add to it so as to have that complete set of tools.
Do you mind, Lynn, if I just work my way back?
One thing on this
more,
point, and then
sure.
we'll move on. I totally
And then we'll
understand
come
that I've
back
asked
around.
a lot of questions. Thank you, Chair. So we've actually had a couple of conversations with hydrogeologists, as I'm sure that you're aware, this committee, and it's been really clear to us that calculating recharge at a specific level is totally different. You can't use provincial averages and know that that's going to be a model you can overlay for the Wilmot River. That local context is actually really important. We were told that measuring recharge is super complicated and it's not really straightforward, and that's not something we have infinite information on. We actually asked quite a lot of questions on that.
So there's 2 points I'd like to make, and I'll probably turn it over to George afterwards, is that firstly, our hydrogeologist does not use the same number across the island. He works individually by watershed and the local area, as you would expect so. And there are a variety of tools that he utilizes to figure out what the appropriate amount is, and utilizes modeling to help determine where the impacts of the withdrawal are and how much those impacts are. Is there anything you'd want to add on the hydrogeological side for that, George?
Yeah, and we know and have worked with alongside these hydrogeologists, worked for us and with us and all that stuff. So I would actually say that I don't think they would suggest recharge rates are wildly all over the place. There are certainly differences. The calculation of recharge rates can be really simple or really complicated, depends. And again, using numerical modeling, you can fine-tune stuff. But certainly our approach is not to assume everything's the same everywhere. However, there are some things that are kind of the same. So the amount of precipitation, the temperature, generally speaking, the snowpack, things like that are pretty uniform, not exactly the same. The geology is not exactly the same, but it varies within certain limits. The porosity of the sandstone, things like that. So there certainly are different estimates. One of the difficulties, people say, well, what is the recharge rate, expecting a single number? Well, it's going to be different in every watershed to some degree, and every year to some degree as well. But it's within a reasonable range. At the end of the day, when we actually look at an extraction permit or whatever, we're looking at the actual stream flow, which is the discharge into the system, which is, by the way, how we usually determine what the recharge rates are as well. So it is customized to the local environment. It's not just we say, okay, this is what happens in PEI, and we'll plug that into every equation. It is customized to the degree one can. Usually with test drilling, pump testing, measuring stream flow, so whether it's the new well field in Stratford or something like that, part of the whole process is looking and monitoring at the stream flow. We have what you'd call sort of index stations where we can use those as a representative of what's happening in eastern PEI or western PEI, central PEI, things like that, and things can be prorated for that. We certainly don't have a recharge rate for every single watershed, but we are in a position where we can make pretty good evaluations of it. The normal sort of concern for recharge is actually looking at groundwater levels. And our policy in the past was we wouldn't take more than 50% recharge, so there's a pretty big buffer there anyhow. Now we're more stringent than that still. And so when we're looking at stream flow influences, we're actually, we're using recharge as a part of the system, but the bottom line is what actually comes out in the stream. And that is customized right to the exact watershed we're looking at. So it is not as mysterious as might think. It's not simple. I mean, it is complex, but it's not an unknown, I guess. And the range of recharge rates is not that stupendous that it really affects our ability to make reasonable predictions on things.
Okay, thanks. All right, next we have Rob.
Yeah, thanks we've heard many times all these stories and issues around that. I guess I wanted to make a little point on the whole issue around the holding ponds. I mean, one of the points it seems to be, holding ponds are a collection of water that's running eventually towards a stream system. It has an inlet and it has an outlet, whatever that level, where the outlet comes to. Under normal circumstances, when the pond is full, I mean, the same amount of water coming in is going out, correct? And so really, in some ways, I think it's actually can have a benefit on the stream situation. When you get a big weather event, it's going to hold some water for a little while and sort of control the flow going into the stream. So what's an adverse effect and what isn't an adverse effect can have many different interpretations, I guess, as far as that goes. But I just wanted to sort of highlight that point, I guess, itself. But one of our committee made recommendations regarding the whole issue around the wells permitted for research. You'd said that you were going to decommission these wells for research afterwards. When we put that issue of the concept of extending the moratorium to all high-capacity wells, you basically made the comment it doesn't apply with science. And I agree with you totally on that. It is to try to be fair and make sure we're not discriminating against one sector or another that wants to have access to the water. But when we go back to the issue of the wells permitted for research can only be used for research, I get that point. But I kind of make the point on the decommissioning afterwards. There would seem to me there would be no science to that whatsoever in the respect that why couldn't the existing landowner apply then to a permit to utilize that if the watershed has the accessibility to water that it could be done, or if this is a political decision on why you're decommissioning it, then, and you don't want it to go to the potential landowner that the well is on, why couldn't it be transferred to, say, the watershed group, and the watershed group then decides? It seems to me it would be redundant and a waste of resources to decommission a well that's already there and being utilized, I guess, other than the political reasons for doing it. So I just wanted to kind of get your sense on that.
I can start with that one, and Bruce can correct me. So with that piece there, you mentioned the idea of that well being transferred to a watershed. Was that your example or something?
Or the landowner. I mean, if it's once again, this sounds to me that this is a political decision to decommission it afterwards.
Well, I think the intent was more so if these are wells for agriculture irrigation research. Agriculture irrigation, there's the moratorium associated with it. And if it were to convert from research to being just for irrigation, it would no longer fit within that category of well. The idea of transferring it to perhaps another user for a completely different purpose would be a different permit, and I believe that would be acceptable. And Bruce, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it would be acceptable to have it applied for a permit that can be issued.
Rob?
I guess all I'm saying is you already have 30-some high-capacity wells in the province as it is, and there's, 13 or 50 of them for agricultural use. It would just seem to be redundant to decommission it and take it out. You know, if the effort was already put there to implement them, why waste the resources? And like I say, to me, it would be political to say you don't want to have the landowner get that benefit of that. That can be fair. I'll take that, and that would be a political decision. Not Liberal, Conservative, or Greens. It's just about trying to appease making sure that the research is unbiased, nobody's taking advantage of the situation in that regard. But if it was transferred over to a watershed group to decide whether they want to generate income by leasing that out to a farmer or whatever it might be, then that would be an option that would exist that doesn't waste, I guess, the impacts and the resources that were put into to drill in the well and leave it there. That's all. I just want to make the point in that.
One other point I might like to make is that the way that the moratorium is constructed in the regulations, we can't issue a agricultural irrigation permit, an extraction permit for agricultural irrigation. So after the research is completed, if we were to issue a permit for someone for a decommissioned research well, it would have to be for a purpose other than for agricultural irrigation.
Rob?
So, but I mean, isn't the whole concept here is to try to see what we can do to end the discrimination to the agricultural community on this? I mean, if the research proves that these high-capacity wells aren't having the impact on the environment or aren't having an impact on the water resources that are there, you'll have to go with some assumptions that the moratorium would be lifted if the science is based on doing that. So can there be a window for those 4 high-capacity wells that they are held in hiatus for a period of time until a decision is made by government to maybe lift the moratorium, or it could be to put the moratorium on everything? I mean, in one way or the other, you can't. You're applying science to one component of it, and then you're really applying politics to the other side of it. That's where I'm kind of coming from.
Yeah. So if the moratorium is removed, that is a change to the regulation. Right? So a change to the regulation in the future changes whether or not they would be decommissioned and whether they would be able to have a permit issued for some other purpose.
Rob?
So maybe I need a definition on what decommissioning means, because maybe decommissioning means just that the well isn't utilized, it sits there, there's no waste of the resources, or as decommissioning means you remove the whole well, cap it, and it's ended. I guess maybe there's some definition that needs to be done there, so maybe I could get an explanation on decommissioning.
I think it's fair to say that I mean, we have a research project that's going to take multiple years, and the exact extent of that would be, flushed out over that time before it's finalized. And as Bruce mentioned, if there's a change in regulation, then perhaps that additional clarity can be provided then.
Rob?
Other than just I emphasize that, like maybe we need that clarity in decommissioning, but I'll cede the questions to the chair again and
All right.
everybody else.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Have you done the modeling on all the various watersheds and what it might look like if a certain amount of wells were added to extraction through a drought year? I ask because we had a hydrologist in here who did this for the Wilmot River watershed and showed us what things might look like if everyone started putting in high-capacity wells for irrigation in that area and what effect it might have during a drought year, just so that we have some sort of baseline to kind of gauge our decisions on what might happen.
We haven't done a what-if across all the watersheds, a PEI. That would be quite a bit of work, of course. We do assess when applications come in, so that we have to make assessments of watersheds as the case may be. And so I guess I'm not exactly sure what area in particular that you're querying about.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So what I'm thinking every watershed. It's just in that presentation that came to us here with the hydrologist, he said it didn't take much time at all. It's very easy to do the modeling that he did using historical data. Forecasting things out to the future and the like are a little bit more difficult, but when you have all the knowns, just throwing it into a modeling software is not terribly difficult, was the impression I got from the hydrologist. So I'm just wondering, have we done that for the various watersheds? It sounds like the answer is no.
We've done it for the ones where we are, we have permits that we've had to entertain. No, it's getting a model calibrated correctly isn't easy. It does take time, and it does take some data, and so it's not an inordinate amount of time. But to ask us to go and do 255 watersheds is quite a bit of work.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Seems like it might be worthwhile work in these conversations we've been having here. It's been many years, but I heard George say himself that it doesn't matter if it's a high-capacity well or a low-capacity well. It's all about the amount of water that's coming out of the ground, really. And I'm just wondering, with this research project requiring high-capacity wells, and with us, well, I guess I'll start with a preliminary question. How many holding ponds being serviced by multiple low-capacity wells that are under these regulations considered a high-capacity well? How many of those are considering being permitted this year or last year? Where are we at with that?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean, because we don't permit low-capacity wells until the regulations come into play. So we don't permit holding ponds and low-capacity wells at this time.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So we don't know how many are going in there at all? We have no data on that?
Well, that's a different question. Yeah, all wells that are drilled have drilling reports, and so that we know that there are low-capacity wells that have been drilled in the last number of years, and a number of them in the last year. The number of holding ponds that have been constructed across the province is approximately 40, and the number of low-capacity wells that support those, and also the systems that don't have holding ponds, is approximately 122.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So, I mean, I guess where my thought process is going here is, if we're putting in this many low-capacity wells, and if 4 of them are considered a high-capacity well, that's equivalent of like 30 high-capacity wells or so going in. Why are we not just considering, like, that's going to have more of an impact than the 4 wells in the research study that we're considering putting in here? Why are we not putting this research into place right now and seeing what effect adding 122 wells to particular watersheds is going to have? Seems like it'd be a low-cost way to access even more valuable data.
I'm not sure what kind of research you're thinking of. Those 122 wells are spread across multiple watersheds, and where there is watersheds that have a significant number of them, we have looked at modeling their impact.
Steve?
Okay, so in watersheds that are getting multiples of these low-capacity wells, you do have modeling completed? How many watersheds do we have modeling completed for?
By hand.
Steve?
Would you be able to get us that information here to this committee?
We can find that out.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair, that's good.
You're good? Lynn, do you have a few more?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chair. So that's all really interesting. I
It's a
would
rhetorical
certainly
question.
appreciate it if it was possible to have those models come back to us. I'd be really interested to see them. Would that be okay? Yeah, fantastic.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I'd certainly appreciate that. So I would be really interested, I suppose what I'm wondering, this has come up a lot in my area, particularly around the Dunk River and the Wilmot River. There's been a number of holding ponds, as I'm told, going in this area. And I guess I have a few questions on that. I know you've said that there is no permitting process associated with the holding ponds as it is, and I was just making a note here that it looks like Section 75(5) of the Act says an authorization that is valid and enforced under the Environmental Protection Act. But I wasn't of the impression that holding ponds triggered the Environmental Protection Act. I suppose I was just looking for some clarity on that.
I think what you need to do is take a look at an additional section, which might be right after that. Let me see if I can find it for you, where it talks about things that don't require a permit but are legal at the time that the regulations and that come into play.
I think it's 77, subsection 7. Yeah.
Thank you.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So I suppose I have a few questions on this because I've had a lot of people ask me this in the area. There's no consideration given right now under the Environmental Protection Act or any other set of regulations to where holding ponds are constructed. Is that a concern for the department?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we were eager to get the Water Act proclaimed is to ensure we can have some sort of mechanism to look at, not just for holding ponds, but that low capacity well category, to finally have the ability to permit those and have that analysis.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I'm also referring to the structure of the holding pond itself. I've had actually a number of farmers bring this to my attention. I've spoken to a number of people who've worked in watershed groups bring this to my attention. There's some concerns about whether or not even a perk test is done to see if the soil in that area is appropriate for holding the water that it's supposed to. There's been a lot of concerns brought up even around the structures of this, and I'm just curious if that's a concern for the department from an environmental perspective.
Certain, to make clear right off the bat with our authorization, we can only weigh in and be involved with the water that's feeding it, right, within the Water Act. In terms of the actual construction of them, it's outside of our purview.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So it does not trigger an environmental impact assessment, or it does not show up as an undertaking under the Environmental Protection Act?
No, that's correct. It's not listed.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Do you think that's an oversight?
I don't think it would be an oversight in that sense, because and I get what you're saying, it can be a significant endeavor to do something like this, but if you're just digging a hole that's within a field, in terms of the environmental impact of that, I'm not sure how immediate that would be with just the hole itself. Certainly the water that's feeding it, and that's where we do feel that we come in with this Water Act.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Let me give you an example. So I have heard from a number of people who are concerned about some multiple holding ponds, in fact, that have gone in at the head of a stream, very close or within scope of where the springs are for that stream. That could certainly have an impact on the amount of water that reaches the stream. There are salmon in that river, for example. I've had multiple farmers bring this to my attention as something that they're concerned about. They're saying, are you even allowed to build holding ponds given their proximity to the head of a stream? But you feel that wouldn't have any notable impact?
I think you need to separate the water supply from the holding pond. A holding pond that is holding water, putting aside where the water comes from, at the head of a stream, wouldn't be expected to have any undesirable impact on a nearby stream. The source of the water supply is the question that where you could have impact. And yes, we're concerned, and that's why the Water Act regulations require low-capacity wells to have permits. And that's the kind of thing that we would be assessing when we get that opportunity.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So I think I'm hearing you say that you do believe that depending on the location of this, not the fact that it is a holding pond, but that water is being redirected, if you will, based on the location of it, could be problematic for a stream, but that itself would not require an environmental impact assessment?
The pond doesn't require a permit. It doesn't require an environmental impact assessment. The wells require an assessment under these regulations.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Okay, I'd like to move on to the drought contingency plan component of the regulations. I think that's an important addition, and I'm curious why that is a may and not a shall. Why is it optional to have a drought contingency plan?
Take a shot at that. I guess there's a huge range of possible water supply projects, and you know, you might be looking at a municipality, you might be looking at a small corner store in the middle of nowhere, or whatever. There are some cases where really it's just not an issue. The notion was large water withdrawal operations which are sensitive to water loss, whether it's irrigation or a factory or a municipality or whatever, are the ones that really need to focus on this. I guess, in essence, we don't require well field protection plans for every individual little private well. It's a matter of paperwork. I mean, it mightn't be a bad thing to do. It probably makes sense for anyone to figure out what am I going to do, you know, if the power goes off or whatever. The notion was, the may is simply there are certain projects where it simply wouldn't make sense, others where it does. And it's as simple as that.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So there's been no thought of clarifying which types of projects will require a drought contingency plan? Specific and clear so everyone knows what to expect?
No. I mean, it's difficult to, how would you look at it? Is it by volume of water they use, sensitivity of their operation to it, what sort of operation they have? So, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. The notion is simply where there's reason, and, you know, trying not to speculate as to what all possible reasons or features you might have in a plan, just to provide the notion that is a consideration we need to look at. It would be difficult in my mind to actually come up with specifics that, okay, if you're a shoe store, you do this. If you're a car washer, you do this. If you're a mall, you do that. If you're a small town, you do this. I mean, it's difficult to actually anticipate all the possible things one looks at. So from that perspective, how you would actually then prescribe in advance what sort of things you might want is very difficult. On the other hand, when you get a proposal coming in, I want to withdraw water for such and such or renew a permit, at that point it makes it much easier to determine whether it makes sense to have a drought contingency plan or not, rather than having some broad brush thing where 90% of the time it may be unnecessary. So it's really with that sense that there's no reason, we don't have that many applications that you can't say, oh, that looks like, you know, it's really tricky. They really depend on exactly that much water. Or maybe it's a fish hatchery or something like that. Whereas some other thing where maybe it's not a real big deal. So that's kind of, you know, the flexibility to address specific applications and what sensitivity or vulnerability there might be for that particular operation. And it makes more sense to determine that once you've got a proposal in, rather than trying to speculate as to what those proposals might be.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just aware that as of June 16th, the minister is going to have to make that decision on a regular basis. So I was just curious what sort of, if it's that hard to give guidance on what should have a drought contingency plan, how will the minister make that decision?
Well, as I say, we don't have any specific guidance on that, and that's something where, you know, on a case-by-case basis, we will have to assess whether it makes sense to have something like that or not.
Lynn?
Can you tell me what would be included in a drought contingency plan?
Well, again, it's going to depend very much on what the water user is. So for, say, a city of Charlottetown, it might be a prohibition on washing cars or, you know, watering your lawn only once a week or something like that. for someone that's irrigating, for instance, if they've got a permit, say for groundwater, and it's not something where there's this, sort of cutoff, it might be that, okay, we have to limit our application to, once a week or once every 2 weeks or something like that. Again, it's going to depend very much on what exactly the circumstances are. If government says you've got to shut down, well, then obviously you got to shut down. If government says you've got to reduce your water use by 50%, then each outfit or business or whatever will have to decide, okay, how can I best meet that requirement? And it will depend on what the actual use of the water is. If it's a food processing thing, maybe shifting the schedule for what they're processing. So again, there's no one size fits all. The notion is to not be caught flat-footed when something happens. It's as simple as that.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So I understand that farmers will have to create their own drought contingency plans for their own operation. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Will they be given any support in doing that? It just seems like that could be quite an undertaking.
I would expect so. I would think one of the key players in something like that would be the Department of Agriculture, actually. We're not horticulturalists. Our job would be to determine what is necessary and how best to accommodate that would be outside our field of expertise.
Lynn?
So I suppose that's more of a question to you, Brad, but I'm curious if there has been any discussion with the Department of Agriculture on how you will develop drought contingency plans for farmers, or what sort of supports will be in place for them to do so.
Certainly the support, and we have talked about that, and they've communicated that support would be there. And as you could probably expect, the first couple will probably take a little more time to develop while we figure out exactly what that proper plan that would be acceptable to us and would work on that side would. But certainly they've indicated their interest in supporting that and their willingness to do so, and for us to work in tandem with it. I feel our departments get along quite well, and I expect that'll continue with this.
Am I able to ask a few questions, Lynn? And then if we have a few minutes left, we can jump back to you. The question I have around the Dunk River, and if, last summer they were pumping surface water. Is it actually better to pump the surface water, or would a high capacity well make more sense? Is there a different effect on the?
Yeah, so yes, the impact is structured differently. So when you're pumping from the surface, you have a 100% immediate impact. If you take 100 gallons out of the stream has 100 gallons less in it instantly. And when you stop pumping, then that restores virtually instantly as well. Groundwater, on the other hand, you take that same 100 gallons a minute out, you don't get an immediate and 100% impact in the stream. The impact to the stream is ameliorated by the groundwater system and takes time before that gets to the stream and has that impact on the stream. Likewise, when you stop pumping, the restoration of that impact takes a similar length of time. One of the things that's different about permitting high-capacity extraction versus wells is that you have to assume that everybody is pumping at the same time from the stream, because the permits don't require that they all get together and decide who pumps on what day. Not to say that that couldn't be done, but that's not the way that we have structured them thus far. So that we have to assume that they're pumping 24 hours a day and that they're all on. So in other words, there has to be enough water in the stream for everybody all at once. It's not typically what producers utilize their permits for. They don't typically utilize them 24/7 for very long periods of time when they're permitting from the stream. So in sense, we are having to be overly cautious when we're permitting from the stream. Permitting from the groundwater, on the other hand, Because of that delayed impact, the impact is more not necessarily on the maximum rate, and the permitting is not on the maximum rate. The permitting is on an average rate. So a producer may have his pump turned on for a while he's irrigating and not turned off, or not turned on for a while, and that can be averaged, if you will. So it doesn't really matter whether everybody's got their pump turned on at the same time or not, and the amount of water that they have to be permitted for to supply can be less, and so that it can be a superior way to permit water while still maintaining desired stream flows.
Have we ever done calculations on what the difference would have been had we had a high-capacity well instead of pumping surface water out of the dump river? Is that something the department's ever done?
Yes, we've done that kind of thing. I don't have those numbers at the top of my head, but generally, if we were to, we can generally permit more high-capacity wells than we can surface water permits while maintaining the same impact in the stream.
Given we have the Water Act that's going to come into effect on June 16th, would the department, I guess, is there still the need for a moratorium on high-capacity wells? Is it a moot point now, or now that we'll have a Water Act that's in place to protect our water, is there a need for a moratorium?
I can certainly start there, and if anyone wants to tag on. The Water Act itself certainly provides a lot more of the tools that we as a department would need to monitor and assess what permits can be provided and how they can fall into what the needs of the individual watershed could be. So it would certainly be a great help in that sense. And George Bruce, you have any points to add on?
I might just add that, we do assess other high-capacity well applications. I have for years. The basic considerations haven't really changed a great deal. And from the groundwater's point of view, it really makes no difference what the water's being used for. Whether you're feeding it into a city or your fun park, golf course, potato field, makes no difference. So from a scientific point of view, the Water Act makes the tools much more explicit. It makes it easier to enforce the rules. We've had and used the same set of tools in a policy basis for quite some time, and have not seemed to, there's always the Winter River, which was sort of developed under a totally different set of considerations and things like that. But in terms of our processes, I think we have the tools. The Water Act strengthens the enforcement and makes them more transparent, I think is the key thing. So on that basis, I guess I have a difficult time seeing a difference in assessing the impact of a high-capacity well that's spraying water in a field, or I guess more specifically, whether it's a potato field or a golf course or a soccer field. The environmental impact's the same, and we have the tools now and use the tools now to assess the impact of that. And the Water Act will make those tools more transparent, more rigidly adhered to and enforced. So it's a very worthwhile tool in that regard.
So I guess what I kind of take from that is it sounds like the department would say that the moratorium is actually, once the Water Act comes into effect, that there's really no need for a moratorium.
They're not going to ask me, I guess, as to how to proceed on that. When you're looking at laws and regulations and all that, there's the science, and there's a lot more than just that. And so I can't really make that decision. Certainly from a scientific point of view, as I said, I don't see the difference between a high-capacity well, a bunch of little low-capacity wells, whether you're sprinkling the water on a golf course, whether you're putting it on a potato field, whether you're making beer with it or sending it to a municipality. So from a scientific point of view, the moratorium doesn't add a tool in my view, that we need. But again, there are probably a lot more considerations than the science.
Is there any plans within the department to lift the moratorium once the Water Act comes into effect without going ahead with the research?
That's not something we can answer. I can answer for sure, yeah.
I mean, the regulations as they're presented here, which would be the ones that would be enacted, have it in place. They committed to doing research on it, but speaking to the regulations that are here in front of us, that's the path we're on.
And just on the research, so there would be was it 4 wells? Is that correct?
It was 4 wells in the original proposal. There's since been another one that expressed interest, a fruit grower, which is being evaluated. And of course, we rely on Mike Van den Heuvel for the selection of this too. And one thing he's exploring is in some of the areas where irrigation happens more often, is there a way research can also take place in there? Of course, from our standpoint is recognizing that there's that certain permit allocation that's already there, and if it's already maxed, there would have to be a trade-off for that to ever happen, and that's something. There's been some interest in that, but the sites themselves, I don't think have been finalized yet. But that's where it's at.
I guess what
the terms of reference that we're coming back with, it'll be firm in that.
So we're going to do this research. But would the department, I guess, think that, well, we already have the research and the science that tells us that we can have high-capacity wells, because the decision to put the moratorium in place in the first place was a political one in 2002, I think it was, and not based on science really at the time, just on the agriculture sector anyway. So is this research, I guess what I'm saying is, for the sake of 4 wells, we already have 30-some high-capacity wells. What are we really going to find out at the end of the day?
I think I could help address that. I mean, part of the notion, certainly, we can predict sort of what's going to happen with the high-capacity well and all that sort of stuff. But part of the process is to also assess, okay, from an aquatic habitat point of view, we need to refine. We've got our sort of statistical approach to what we think's fair to leave in the stream now. The purpose of the research is to confirm that it's appropriate for PEI conditions and to really add to the get away from just a statistical sort of thing and actually look at what the real impact on fish are and fish habitat and stuff like that. So in my view, that's, Bruce can probably add to this or speak to it better, but the added value is particularly in that aspect.
So I know you guys aren't going to make the decision on whether or not the moratorium's lifted, but would you say that based on the science you have right now, that if there is a need for a moratorium or not? Like if it was lifted, would you be comfortable with that? I know it's not your decision to lift it or not.
Yeah.
But
what I could say
would you
is
say there's any need for it
if it was lifted,
based on science?
If it was lifted, we would use all our existing tools to assess applications and would be comfortable making decisions on them like we do with other high-capacity wells.
Based under the new regulations under the Water Act, is that?
With those regulations, yes.
Before these regulations, would you have been comfortable with that?
We would be comfortable with under our current rules as well. We have continued since 2002. We have been assessing high-capacity wells for implementation all along. And so we have refined and changed the assessments, improved the assessments. We now provide for more protection than we did 20 years ago. But the Act adds clarification and transparency. It doesn't change our ability to assess high-capacity wells.
Okay, so I guess just to clarify, there's no plans in the immediate future to lift the moratorium.
Our plans right now are to proceed with these regulations as they're stated and continue the conversation that I'm sure will continue. A key point with that too is while we do plan on enacting these on June 16th, much like any regulation, we consider these to be evergreen. I'm sure there will continue to be conversations on them, and we'll continue to look at them. And as George mentioned earlier, the next and exciting step is the water management planning areas, which will also give us some great tools we can work with as a department of managed water.
Okay. Lynn, did you have maybe a couple questions? I know we're at
One.
time, but I kind of cut you off, so.
2 quick comments. I'll be
Sure,
brief
yeah.
on them. The point that you had made on, specifically to you, Chair, on withdrawing water from the Dunk River, if we had done it through one high-capacity well, would it have had less impact than drawing from the stream? Sort of loses the context of the situation, that it's not just one farmer in the area. They couldn't all use the same high-capacity well or the same 2 high-capacity wells. So I guess my question is, how many water extraction permits in the Dunk River exist?
There are, if my memory serves, 9 surface water permits.
Yes,
Lynn?
so you could never have all of that coming from one capacity well, one high-capacity well anyway. That's just, you're not comparing apples to apples in any way. We are talking about a whole bunch of people who are spread out over a significant area. And I hear from some of those people who are concerned that if the holding ponds that are in place now are filled up earlier in the year, and then the water levels drop, that people who regularly rely on surface water irrigation are likely to have their permits revoked. Do you have any concern about equality and equal access to water now that some of it will be stored ahead of time, and then the people who rely on their surface water permits and didn't have the money to put a holding pond in won't be able to access water when they need it? It just doesn't seem like a very fair process.
Fairness is a difficult thing to achieve, and one of the things that you should keep in mind is that the 9 permits are the maximum number of permits in that watershed, and other producers haven't been able to obtain a permit for years.
Last one, final question.
I agree.
Lynn,
Thank you, Chair.
sorry.
I agree with you, and I think that's a real challenge in the area. I think the question has never been yes or no on high-capacity wells. It's what is the fair amount that we can take, and how do you determine what a fair share amount is? And simply saying, yes, we'll lift the moratorium and people can put in as many high-capacity wells on the Dunk River as they want, doesn't achieve fairness. It doesn't achieve equality. I'm sorry, do I have the floor, or do you have the floor,
Lynn?
Finance Minister? Thank you. So, you're more than welcome to ask questions,
Lynn, you
Minister,
have the
if you'd like
floor.
to get on the list. Thank you. So I suppose my last question for you is, how do we achieve fairness for the various farms who are concerned, who will also be impacted by climate change, who are also being impacted by dry conditions this summer, who are also struggling but didn't put in a holding pond? Do we have concerns that the 16 new holding ponds that draw as much water as a high-capacity well, that will fill up before the water level in the dunk drops, they'll have access to water and no one else will? How do we achieve fairness in that environment?
I may be paraphrasing a bit here, but I think your question is, if you have a watershed that's reached its full allocation and someone else wants to access water, what approach would we be going about for assessing that? Traditionally, as a department, it has been almost the first come, first serve. We've talked about that internally, of whether that actually is something that will remain as our standalone policy, but it's something that's on our radar, and as I alluded to, the many future conversations we have, that'll be one of them.
Could I just add a real quick thing? Also, this really highlights, when we look at the water sustainability plans and things like that, that might be the ideal forum where collectively within a watershed, we can reach some sort of arrangement where this is how we will meet the maximum number of demands, things like that. So it's not that we're indifferent to this sort of stuff, but we only have certain tools. So when it comes to sort of the equity of, who's got what and all that, that's kind of outside what we've got. But this might be an opportunity to provide a forum where that can be worked out.
Okay. Just before, do we have any new business, anyone? Any new business? Are we able to just whip right through that? Okay. Just like to thank our guests for coming in. I know it was short notice, and thanks for your time this morning and answering all of our questions. There's quite a few of them, so it's much appreciated. Usually I'd recess to let you pack up, but I think we can get through this agenda fairly quick, so we don't have any new business. Motion to adjourn? So moved. Thank you, Lynn.